a production space, what's the big deal? You can produce a photo or video anywhere. Everything can be a production space. And that's really far from the truth. Every space is different. The quality of the light is different. The creative opportunities are different. Whether it is a modern setting with a view of an urban skyline, or is it exposed brick with wooden beams, they're all different and they serve different purposes. So in our market, what the outside world doesn't really get instantly is that supply and demand are heterogeneous, and it will always be that way.
Hey everyone, this is Devin Miller here with another episode of The Inventive Expert. I'm your host, Devin Miller, the serial entrepreneur that's grown several startups into 7- and 8-figure businesses, as well as the founder and CEO of Miller IP Law, where he helps startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. If you ever need help with yours, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat, and we're always here to help. Now, today on The Inventive Expert, we have another great guest on, Van Gothner. And Van, we're going to be talking a little bit about a few different things. One is kind of understanding, or how to understand the competitive environment and how to develop a product in light of that competition, and talk a little bit about how to view profitability and balance sheets, and also thinking about other ways of growth, and including sometimes acquiring competitors or doing other things or alongside competitors. So with that, much as an introduction, welcome on the podcast, Van.
Thanks very much, Devin. Good to be with you again.
Hey, excited to have you back on. So, and for those of you that haven't caught, Ben was on the Inventive Journey, which is a sister podcast of this one. So definitely feel free to go and check out Van's episode and hear a little bit more about his journey. But for those listeners that haven't had a chance to catch up on that episode, you're saying, hey, just give me the quick or 1 or 2 minute overview. Or introduce yourself to the audience for a second.
Sure, thanks very much. I am the co-founder of Space for Arts, which is a global B2B marketplace for production professionals, and the production spaces that they use to create the compelling content that we see around us today. And importantly, it's not only a discovery platform, but it is a marketplace powered by an underlying workflow SaaS solution, which brings the pen and paper workflows of these professionals into the 21st century. I started my career as an investment banker, but have been working independently and as an entrepreneur for longer than I've worked for other people. So it's been a great ride.
Awesome. Well, that definitely sounds like a great place to be, and a great business. And so now with that, now as we talk or dive into the topic at hand, which is some of the expertise you're going to share, one of the things we talked a little bit more or before the podcast was, I think, a great place to be. And I think everybody intuitively knows that they should do it, but the level of effort that they put into understanding the competitive environment will vary. And I'll give the 30-second spill on my end. Is I'll have people that come into my office, where we do a lot of work with a lot of startups and small businesses, and it'll be everything from, hey, I've got a great idea, I haven't even bothered to take 5 minutes and Google it, but I'm sure it's a great idea and I'm going to pursue it, all the way to I spent months and maybe sometimes even years looking at the market and understanding the competitive environment, and they probably have gone way overboard rather than getting started, of just over analyzing it or using an excuse to not get started. So when you're looking at kind of understanding the competitive environment, how do you go about what's the right balance, and how do you go about doing it?
Well, a starting point is, and Devin, I think you probably experienced this as well, how many entrepreneurs sit down across the table from you and declare that they have no competition?
All the time. And I think I always point out that, well, to some degree, if you narrow it down enough, it's always true. I mean, if you say you niche down to the very thing, then yeah, maybe that's true. But the example I usually give is, let's say you were the very first person to invent the car. People say it was Henry Ford. He didn't really invent the car. He just made it a lot better. But let's say you invented the car. Well, before that, you had horses and you had horse and buggies. Before that, you just had horses. Before that, alongside that, you had bicycles. Alongside that, you had walking. Alongside that, you had trains or boats. And there's always another form. Now, are they the same as a car? No, they're not the same. Doesn't mean that they're not competition. It just means you may be better or different than them, but they're still your competition. So yeah, all the time. And that's usually the go-to example I'll give.
Right. And it's, I had somebody along a similar vein that announced their competition was the way things are done today.
Well, that's not a bad answer in the sense that it is how it's done. There is, however it's done today is your competition, but it
Right.
doesn't mean it's not a strong competition, just as how it's done. But yeah.
But right. But to your point, people are doing it. Yep. Whatever you're trying to do, people are finding a way. Very few people are creating a brand new category where it's truly an open field, blank slate, where nobody's doing this or whatever this may be. Yep. So people are solving a problem or trying to solve a problem for a process or an activity that is taking place. So understanding how that is happening today is vital. And
absolutely,
it's vital to work out how you are going to enter that market and what the barriers you may be facing are as a threshold matter, but it's also vital to understand it from the point of view of building your product.
Mm-hmm. No, and I agree with that. Now, let me kind of ask the follow-up question, the probing question, which is great. Let's say I'm in agreement. I need to understand the competitive marketplace. How do you do that? Because I mean, is it just go and Google it? Is it go and visit their stores, go buy their products? Is it, go talk to their customers? Is it research it? Is it go look at their patents? Is it, how do you go back? Because there's a lot of different ways, and some of them you can go down rabbit holes, and some of them you're not going to get very fruitful information. So how do you go about actually understanding your competition once you understand everybody has competition?
Right. It's understanding their user experience. Become a user yourself. Give it a try. Put yourself on the receiving end of what they are sending out to people. Talk to their users to understand their experience. Looking at somebody's patent, well, that's nice, but the users don't look at the patent.
Sure.
The business is based on how users interact with the product or service.
And I definitely agree. Now I'll ask a question though, which is, let's say as an example, and I'll make it up. I came out with the next greatest, best, we'll say, trying to think of fork. I'm just going to go with a fork because that was the first thing that came to my mind that was a little bit more obscure. So how do I go about, do you go to where the customers are purchasing? Because in other words, sometimes, and fork maybe isn't the best one because you could just go to maybe a store where you buy forks, I guess, or a Walmart or that. But the problem is sometimes you don't always know how to go to talk to their customers, or you can experience it yourself. You could go sign up to be their customer, or you could otherwise go talk with them. But on the other hand, if it's something where it's an online product or something of that nature, I may not know where to go and talk to their customers because I don't know where their customers are or how to reach them. So any thoughts on it? Because I love the idea of going and talking with the current customers of the way it's being done today. How do you kind of find those customers or where those customers are at or be able to reach out to them?
Well, presumably they're going to become your customers if you're competing against them, right?
Sure.
And so if you can't find them, you don't even have a starting point for a business. So, they're going to be your customers. So you need to go out and find them and chat them up and understand what their problems are. There's an example from many years ago. The airline SAS, Scandinavian Airline Systems, had recruited a new chief executive. And he made sure they didn't announce it, so that he could spend a few months experiencing the product.
No,
and what he did is that, when he took the job, when it was announced, he said, look, once you're on the aircraft, the seat needs to be comfortable, the service needs to be good, but you win or lose the battle on the ground. So getting the passenger from the curb through the airport experience onto the aircraft and off the other end. So he spent a lot of time as a leader understanding that customer experience so he could execute against that and improve it.
No, and I think, you know, it's almost kind of, and I don't think it's still around. I haven't watched it for a while, so it could be. But you know, it's almost that undercover, you know, undercover boss or whatever the show that used to be. And you know, that one's, you know, much more televised, and you know how real it is, or how much reality TV show. Putting that aside, I do think, you know, almost becoming that undercover boss or undercover customer, you know. And I like to do, to your point of, if you can't figure out where your competitors' customers are, be able to figure out how to, maybe it's not their exact customers that that just purchased it today, but if you can't be or figure out who their customers are going to be or what those customers are, you're not going to be able to go and sell it yourself. Or how are you going to do that when you actually do build your product and need to sell it? You're going to have to find those customers anyway. So figuring that out on the front end and then talking with them, I think that's definitely a great idea to kind of, you know, go undercover, so to speak, and not even just, you know, hiding it, to say, hey, we think we can do it better. We have a good idea. We wanted to get your experience with this. And then you're going to have to figure out how to incentivize them to want to talk with you, because everybody gets bombarded with surveys and calls and everything else. But I think working through that gives you a much better insight.
You know, for example, this past week at Space for Arts, we spent a lot of time this week in user testing for some new product functionality that we have planned and are now confirming we will build it and deploy it. But talking to customers and taking them through mock-ups of this functionality, I mean, not only did we get a lot of great feedback on our design and the user flow we had envisaged, which was reinforcing, but my Lord, did they open up about competition and tell us things that was really powerful and affirming for us. It was great. So if you engage your customers as your product evolves, you're going to have, you really develop the kind of trust to understand what their experience is in other environments.
No, and I think that's definitely the case. Now I'll follow up kind of just one question to that, which is, so let's say I identify the customers, you know, or potential customers, kind of who those customers would be for the way it's done today, so to speak, your competition. You know, it's still hard to get sometimes if you have a really great product or you have connections, you can get an in and get some feedback. But the other time it's like, okay, let's say it's a B2C, so, you know, business to consumer,
Right.
direct to consumer type of product, and you know, you're going to do a bit of a mass appeal. Well, going and asking people, hey, do you have 5 or 10 minutes for a talk about this product? A lot of people are going to say no, and I'm probably one of them, unless you offer me a good enough gift card or something to incentivize me. Otherwise, I'm going to say, hey, I'm busy. There is nothing in it for me. If I know you or have a connection, I'll probably do it out as a courtesy. But otherwise, I'm going to say it's just, you know, I've got too many other things that are demanding on my time. I don't have time to devote to, or, you know, just doing something on the kindness of my heart. So how do you, whether it's B2B, you know, or B2B, where you're going to businesses or going to other consumers, how do you get them, once you identify who the potential people are that you should be talking with, how do you incentivize them, or how do you get them to talk with you?
Well, on the B2B side, we found it remarkably easy, because what we were presenting was a solution to a really well-known problem. And they said, if you've got a solution, I want to hear about it. In the B2C world, it is tougher, because you do have to, you know, pay people for their time, as it were. If you're going to take an hour of their time or 15 minutes, you want to give them something in return. You know, our users this past week were remarkably generous with their time. You know, we were getting folks that, you know, we asked for 30 minutes and they were volunteering us 90 minutes to get into real detail. Consumers, it's tougher. You know, very often on a consumer panel, you're going to have to find friends or engage a research firm to get users in a room and test them. You know, when you're behind the famous one-way mirror, or two-way mirror, and observing the reactions. But you need to know your users. You need to know your customers. The customer's in the center of everything. Because they're the ones that pay you. You know, they write the check.
And I agree. I think sometimes it's easier if it's a really cool product. People are excited about it. They'll probably make time just because they want to get, the inside track, so to speak, on be able to get access to it. On the other hand, if it's one, it can be a good product, but if it's one that it's not just earth shattering, or it's not just something that there's so much pent up demand, then I think you have to be cognizant of, you're probably going to have to incentivize them to, whether it is, for me at least, and I always drives me nuts when they say, well, we're having a survey and we're giving away 5 gift cards. And I'm like, yeah, but there's probably 1,000 people that are going to do the survey. Even if there's only 5 people to do the survey, I always look and said, my odds probably aren't that good. So I think you have to look and say, what is the incentive for them to talk to you? And if it is valuable enough that it is going to be informative of your product, it's probably a worthwhile investment, even if you have to pay them or otherwise incentivize them to do that. So now let's say, kind of moving the conversation forward, as we talked a little bit more. So let's say you go out, you find who the competition is, you even go out and talk to some of their customers or some of the potential customers that are out there, and you're looking and saying, okay, I've got all this information, kind of now, what do you do with it as far as developing the product? And I'll give you a couple scenarios. One is, you're always going to have the outliers. You're going to have the people that just tell you how amazing your product is, no matter if it is or not. And you're also going to tell you, or have people tell you how crappy your product is, no matter how amazing it is or not. And, it's always hard because those two ends of the spectrum. You're either going to love hearing all the amazing feedback and you're going to take that. You're going to say, well, it's going to do amazing because these 3 people out of 500 told me it's going to be amazing. Or you're going to say, oh, our product will never work because these 2 people out of 1,000 told me it's not going to work. So how do you kind of balance that, or what do you do to take in that information in light of the product development?
Well, one, make sure you have a legitimate sample set, right? You don't go to your best friends who aren't going to give you hard truths if you need to hear hard truths. It's like getting your mother and father in the room and say, what do you think of this idea? Oh yeah, that's wonderful, darling. Yes. Honey, we're proud of you. You don't want that. So you need a real sample set, and you have to be pretty hardcore about it and be willing to hear ideas that don't affirm your own beliefs. And look, as a society, we have a problem with that anyway. Nobody, everybody lives in their own echo chamber, but that's death from a business point of view. You have to be willing to hear other views and other approaches, and separate out somebody's known bias. If you know they have a bias, understand that and put their commentary in that context. But don't believe your own PR. If you're convinced you have a good idea, you'll convince yourself forever that it's a great idea, but you have to be intellectually honest to absorb and process information that's counter to your beliefs in order to move that product forward.
No, and I think that this is a conversation that we could spend long time on. Just I think
indeed,
it is.
Indeed,
it's a hard one, right? Because I think that the balance is, again, I'll go back. I like the family one. One is family, friends, even people that are just you'll either get one of two ways. Sometimes families are really nice, and other times they're the ones that are your harshest critics. I mean, sometimes you tell your family, like, oh yeah, there's Devin with another crazy idea that will probably never go anywhere and not work. And so they're gonna, they're gonna be, well, what about? And then they're gonna bring up, what about all your other failures, and what about? Or they're gonna just be too nice and want to be supportive and want to encourage you, and so they're gonna tell you your idea is great. Either way, to your point, there's a lot of biases built in, and it's very difficult. Not that you may not ask them, but you better not or leave that as your sample size. And other than if you're wanting to get some very more thoughts and initial feedback before you go and ask customers, but it should not be your sample size. But I think that the difficulty is, the other, and I'll shift gears a little bit. The other difficulty I've found is when you go and ask customers, and it's highly dependent on the product, is sometimes they don't know what they want. In other words, if you were to take kind of almost, and I think I'll attribute to Steve Jobs, although I don't know if it's really attributed to him, but it was kind of like he'd always go and, people didn't know what they want until they saw the iPhone. In other words, if you would have gone and seen the BlackBerry, they would have said maybe a little bit bigger screen or a little bit bigger buttons or something like that. And it wasn't until somebody came along and actually made something that was much more, it's not like phones weren't out there. There was touchscreen phones, there were phones that had keyboards, there were phones that were connected to the internet. It wasn't until you integrated that and made it a good package and a good user experience that it all came together. And yeah, you would have gone out and asked the customers, they're not going to tell you exactly what they may give you some thoughts and guidance and feedback once you come up with something. So where is that balance of how early do you go talk with the customers? How much do you rely on them for feedback as far as direction you should take the product? Or is it more of once you have an idea and you've developed it to a point, you're just getting more confirmation? Or if, you know, and that's why I said it's a complex thing of getting customer feedback, is how do you go about kind of incorporating all of those competing interests?
You know, and it's interesting because using the Apple example, and Steve Jobs, he had a vision about what the technology could achieve. And so, you know, if you went to user test it, how do you get a real response unless you tell the people the technology can do this? What do you think? So he had to package that technology and those skills in a way to present something that people hadn't thought about before. But there are very few of those opportunities, right? I mean, very often a product is an evolution from existing practices or an existing way of doing things. And so, you know, so the answering the question is less complex when you put it in that context. You know, if you think about, and it's top of mind because we're using it a lot as we're doing some product in iteration right now, whether it's a Miro board or Figma, you know, you're basically talking about a virtual whiteboard as though you would sit in a conference room with arrows going different places and mocking up ideas and posting a picture up or a schematic and letting it go, right? Well, you know, those threshold ideas were, how do we take a whiteboard and make it the collaborative whiteboard experience and make that work virtually? And then you start getting input from people about the user experience and the user interface and what's a good way to make it work.
No, let me ask one other. Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, fine. You go.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things, and I said this is an area that I find interesting, and so I said we're probably not even going to get to the rest of things on the list, is because I love it or enjoy talking about it, if nothing else, for my own personal benefit, and hopefully for the audience finds it interesting as well. You know, one of the other things I think is difficult is, at least in my probably biased experience, is most people aren't very imaginative. It is hard. And sometimes if you get engineers, sometimes if you get creative individuals, it works. But a lot of times, you know, if you try and, unless they have it in front of them, can see it, experience it, and work with it, it can be difficult for them to imagine what it could be. So almost going back to that same Steve Jobs, you know, just as an example, you know, with Steve Jobs, it would have been hard to probably easily convey, unless you had a mock-up or something that's reasonably functional, to say, hey, well, we're going to get rid of all the keyboard. And then people are going to say, well, how am I going to type? And how am I going to navigate if I don't have either my scroll wheel or my back and forth buttons? Well, you're going to do touch. And well, how do I do it? You know, and all those questions, and, you know, how do I navigate and come back and forth? And they had to grapple with that as well. It's not like they had the answer on the front end, but even as you put it out to the customers to get that feedback, sometimes it's just hard for them to be imaginative to the point that they can get the vision and do it. And yet on the opposite side, and I'll play devil's advocate on both sides, sometimes you'll get yourself in a spot where you're going to say, well, they just don't get it. If they only understood my vision, once I dump these millions of dollars into the product, they'll then get it, and it will be, you know, if I build it, they will come type of a thing. And yet then you'll get in yourself and you'll convince yourself that they just don't get it, and I'm just going to push ahead, when really you're missing the mark. And so it's kind of on both ends, where sometimes they don't get it and you have to show them, and yet sometimes if you wait so long to develop it, that you go down the wrong path, and it won't work, or it's not going to be well received. So any thoughts on how you balance that?
Incrementally. You know, one of the things, you know, what Space for Arts is doing is that we're leveraging the idea of the Airbnb-like discovery platform, but then taking these pen and paper workflows that are rooted in the mid-20th century into the 21st century. So you're going from the horse and buggy into a Formula One car. You
Hmm.
don't do it all at once because you overwhelm your user, right? You take them incrementally, say, okay, we're going to do this. Oh, that's great. Oh, that's interesting, but could you do this? Well, you know, some of those things, could you do this, are already in our roadmap because we've anticipated it and it's part of our vision. But if you dumped it on everybody at once, they would get lost.
No, and I think that's absolutely true. And I think that incrementally checking back in with the customers, and you do have to, I think, be careful, because sometimes customers can send you down rabbit holes. We're saying, well, what about this? And you're like, oh, that's a great idea. Well, let's incorporate that. And then, oh, what about this? That's another great idea. And before you know, you've built out first of all, a probably way too overbuilt product that is, too many functions. And that's kind of why some of the products that you're saying, oh, it has all this great function, but I don't know how to use it, and I'm not going to use half of those features. And it's because they can keep building it in. And yet you also have to, incrementally say, now we have to take everything with a grain of salt. They're going to give us feedback. Maybe we can build that in later on, or that's a separate product. But I think it's always that balance. So,
right.
Well, we've already gotten to the end of the podcast, and it feels like we could talk a much longer in detail and a lot more things. But it was a fun conversation. I think definitely insightful. So I'll have to have you maybe back on one of the subsequent podcasts in the series, and we can chat a little bit more about things. But before, or as we wrap up, and I have the one question I always ask at the end of this episode, is a quick teaser to everybody. We are doing the bonus question where we'll talk a little bit about one crazy entrepreneurial idea. And so if you want to hear that, stay tuned after we wrap up the normal episode, and we'll jump into that right after. Before we jump to the bonus question, the normal question I ask at the end of each episode, and we'll jump to that now, is within your industry, what is the biggest myth and why is it wrong?
One of the big myths in our industry is that, and this is from the point of view of outsiders, because I find that within an industry, there are not too many myths. People know the reality. But from the outside, people say, a production space, what's the big deal? You can produce a photo or video anywhere. Everything can be a production space. And that's really far from the truth. Every space is different. The quality of the light is different. The creative opportunities are different. Whether it is a modern setting with a view of an urban skyline, or is it exposed brick with wooden beams, they're all different and they serve different purposes. So in our market, what the outside world doesn't really get instantly is that supply and demand are heterogeneous, and it will always be that way.
No, I think that's definitely, it's a myth that it's understandable how sometimes people arrive at it, but definitely one that's good to dispel. Yep. So with that, now as we wrap up the episode, before we jump to the bonus question, if people want to reach out to you, they want to be a customer, they want to be a client, they want to be an employee, they want to be an investor, they want to be your next best friend, any or all of the above, what's the best way to reach out to you, contact you, find out more?
My email, van, at space4.
And it cut out there just a little bit, so say it one more time.
Okay. My email, please, and I'm happy to hear from all of you. Van, at spaceforarts.com.
All right, perfect. Well, I definitely encourage people to reach out, connect up with Van for any or all of the above reasons, and definitely a great resource. And so, well, thank you, Van, for coming on the podcast. It's been it's been a pleasure. Now, for all of you that are listeners, to help us to share all this great expertise with all the other startups and small businesses out there, make sure to click share, subscribe, and leave us a review, because we want to make sure that they all can have access to this great expertise to help them along their journey. And with that, if you ever need help with patents, trademarks, or anything else with your startup or your small business, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat. We're always here to help. So now, as we shift gears, as we've wrapped up the normal phase of the episode or of the podcast, and diving into a bit of the bonus question, it's always kind of a fun thing. And I always preface this with, this is, for me, one crazy entrepreneur idea is kind of that always that someday pile, the day, and at least that's what I call it for myself, which is I have all these ideas that I think would be fun ideas, would be great ideas, and I'm sure would be wildly successful, but I never quite have time or the money or the bandwidth to do them. And so I always kind of put them in that someday pile, where I think it'd be fun to pursue someday, but we'll see if I ever get to them. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you to share a little bit about what is your one crazy entrepreneurial idea.
Well, I don't know if it would be remarkably profitable or anything, Devin, but I think it would be useful. There's really no transparent resource to evaluate VCs from the point of view of companies looking to raise money or portfolio companies. The firms themselves spend a lot of time publishing their successes and highlighting people they want to highlight. Not every deal goes smoothly. And what's really important is when things don't go smoothly and how people behave. And even how they behave at the outset when they're screening companies. Do they actually respond to an inquiry in a timely and a polite manner? Do they give true, genuine and constructive feedback? Do they spend a lot of time with you and then ghost you? What is it? And nobody holds this community accountable. It's fascinating. If you're in a client-facing business, you're expected to behave certain ways and respond in a certain way. And not the entire community doesn't do so.
No, and I think it's a great idea. And I don't know if there's a marketplace or not. I mean, there's certainly a lot of marketplaces for review. Amazon, a lot of the reason people like to buy things on Amazon because you can go see all the reviews, and whether or not they're all completely accurate or whether or not some of them are made up is a different question. But same thing on, Yelp, and same thing on other restaurants. And so I think that, certainly within this industry, it is one that's a lot harder to be transparent on. Now, I'll give the one pushback for to play devil's advocate on their side, which is, but what we're going to have is every person that we don't fund that's sour grapes, even if we did a great job, is going to be frustrated that we didn't fund them. We don't have unlimited funds, that may not go well. So any thoughts on, if you were to actually do the business, how you would filter out or fairly account for people that are just angry because they thought they had a great idea, the VCs that didn't line up with what they're doing or wasn't investable, or angel investors, venture capital angel investors, and then they get all these terrible reviews, not because they're not doing a great job, but because they're getting people that are frustrated they don't get the investment dollars.
Many years ago, I ran a private equity fund for a British merchant bank. And I built a powerful network by saying no, and saying no quickly and well. My deal flow went through the roof because if somebody brought us an opportunity, within days, we would say no and why we didn't like it. Not, well, it just doesn't fit. We gave a real reason. And if we spent some more time with them, if it was a rejection in the end, we gave real reasons and we're transparent about why. And very often, if we were saying no, we would instantly say, but this is the firm that might be interested, and make an introduction. And
I think that you hit on it, or hit on that in the sense that I think one is setting up realistic expectations, letting them on the front end, hey, we only fund a small portion of businesses, not because they're not great businesses, but it may not fit well with what type of businesses we have expertise in, or it may not, we are very selective, or, and then to your point is let them know, or set the expectations, let them know early, and then also say, but, here's what we can do to help you, or here's something you might want to consider, or give them some meaningful, actionable thing of here's another person to approach, or here's what you want to think, or here's the stage that you would need to be in before we'd be able to do it.
Exactly.
And I think that doing those things, then it comes across as, hey, we're not just telling because we can't fund you, but we're still there trying to help. And I think that is definitely a great takeaway as to how you would make, if you were to ever pursue the idea. And I think it's a good one. I would definitely use it, what that would be. So awesome. Well, with that, now as we've heard the One Crazy Entrepreneur did, and as we wrap up the podcast, thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure, and wish the next leg of your journey even better than the last.
Thanks. Always good to speak with you, Devin. Thanks very much.